100 years ago, Southampton would have been abuzz with the excitement of the impending departure of the Titanic. This is the very dock she sailed from. In fact, the bollards are the original ones that she was tied up to before she headed off on that ill-fated journey to New York. There were more than 500 locals who died on the ship. They were part of the crew. And so as this city approaches the anniversary, the interest and fascination is just as intense. And adding to the wealth of information about the ship and the tragedy is the new Sea City Museum.
So what we've got in this display is a huge interactive, really explaining how Southampton provisioned the ship, and there are all sorts of amazing things on Titanic. 40,000 eggs, 8 cases of raw feathers, and just some unusual items as well. So we've been able to provide some examples of these with items from our collection. So in here is a picture of the smoking room in Olympic. Olympic and Titanic were exactly the same. They were sister ships, and it just really shows the grandeur.
And you could hear the people screaming and threshing about in the water. And finally the ghastly noise of the people threshing about and screaming and drowning, that finally ceased.
And then a most terrible explosion. And of course right after the explosion she went down.
It's here that Southampton believes it's paying proper tribute to the crew for the first time.
The wall behind us just shows what percentage of crew came from Southampton, and that's a story we're telling in Sea City Museum, is that we provided largely the crew. This huge crew wall shows every single member of the crew with photographs where we've got them, with silhouettes where we don't, and it just shows the overwhelming majority came from this city or gave Southampton as a postal address. Some would have arrived just short term in advance, had lodgings, because trying to get a berth on Titanic was going to be a really important job in times of great strife in England.
And I imagine that a lot of them would have been quite young.
Certainly a lot of young people on board. The significant percentage of the crew worked in the boilers room, trimmers, stokers, firemen and so on. Very, very physical jobs, and I don't imagine that many older people would have been able to cope with just the emphasis on physical exertion required to carry out those tasks.
And have you had families of the crew coming in here and looking for the name of their relative?
Absolutely. We've had a couple of soft openings already, and we've been working with descendants to help develop the content of the museum, and it's been great, and we see that as a sort of very much dynamic engagement with the collection, and the exhibition is going to be really important. So we've had people, for example, come in and say, well, my relative or ancestor is Mr. Ingram. I do have an image of him, and that's going to be great, because we're going to be able to update not just the images on here, but other information that we have about crew members elsewhere in the exhibition.
The red dots mark where they lived. Barely a street was left untouched by grief.
There were a lot of very young people. There were a lot of young people who either had a very young family or whose wives were pregnant, and whose children were born not knowing their father. And obviously it was a time when there was no social security, so if the breadwinner in the family died, it was just bad luck, you couldn't eat. And there were harsh times.
The museum has also pulled together an extraordinary collection of memorabilia and souvenirs, from the board games to the bath plugs, some a little absurd, others requiring consumption. Well, this is set to be a pretty popular part of this museum, I'd imagine. It's a simulator, and you're behind the wheel and you're going to sail the Titanic out of the port. Hang on, I've just got to take it to starboard side because I'm not doing very well here, but just as Captain Edward John Smith did 100 years ago, you are basically on the bridge of the Titanic. 100 years on from the very moment she set sail, the families of survivors and victims will gather here at the dock, and Ron Hancock will think of his lucky grandfather who missed out on a job as a cabin boy on the Titanic.
He was actually alongside the berth where we are now 100 years ago, watching the Titanic sail, with his feeling rather down, but on the other hand, a week later when he realised the ship had sunk, he was alive and many of his friends weren't.
This is a city with more than its share of Titanic stories. Lisa Millar, ABC News, Southampton.